Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where we sit down with the people who give shape, texture, and voice to life on the North Fork of Long Island. Some are rooted here by generations, others arrive by chance or choice, but all carry with them a piece of the story. We talk about what's changing, what's worth holding on to, and the currents of history, both quiet and loud, that run through this place. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 207, we sit down with writer and collaborator Liz Welch, whose work spans family history, personal narrative, and the kinds of real-life stories that stay with readers long after the last page. From her own family memoir, The Kids Are All Right, to the best-selling I Will Always Write Back, Liz has spent her career exploring resilience, connection, and the ways our histories shape who we become. She's written for many of the country's leading magazines and newspapers, consistently drawn to voices and experiences that reveal our shared humanity. Through her work in collaborative memoir, she's helped people navigate the personal parts of their histories while crafting narratives that resonate with readers. Liz eventually found her way to the North Fork and made it part of her life. Contributing not only as a writer but as a community member, she's helped start the local chapter of Coming to the Table, a national organization focused on racial healing and reckoning with the legacy of slavery. In our conversation, we talk about the roots that shaped her, the art of collaborative storytelling, the stories that continue to inspire her, and her hopes for the future of the North Fork. So I hope you enjoy episode 207 with Liz Welch. This episode was recorded July 30th, 2025. Thank you so much for coming on the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. It's really great to have you on today.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And so with these interviews, I usually like to start off with a little background, even if you could share a little bit about yourself, even your ancestry. But I guess first we could start off with where you were born and raised.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Bedford, New York, which is like an hour north of Manhattan. And I was actually born in Mount Kisco, New York, and we lived in Bedford. And I went to school there, public school, all the way through high school. Graduated from Fox Lane High School in 1986. And interestingly, that's where my sort of first book, not to launch into who I am as I'm a writer, but my first book is very much based on those teenage years living in Bedford, New York. So that's where I grew up.
Okay.
Yeah.
And does your ancestry go far back in that area?
No. My mother was a soap opera actress and loved to ride horses, which is why we wound up in Bedford, New York. She grew up on the Morgan Horse Farm in Middlebury, Vermont. Her father, my grandfather, who I never met, he died when she was 16. He was a judge of Morgan horses, nationwide. And when my mother, so she grew up on the Morgan Horse Farm, which is famous for people who care about Morgan horses. It also was the setting for Justin Morgan Had a Horse, which is a book that was written and turned into a Disney movie back like in the 60s maybe or 70s. So her father wound up becoming the head of the stables in Falls Church, Virginia for the government, for the federal government when the government had horses. That brought them down to Falls Church. And it's a really interesting question about my background because I am a writer and I do a lot of collaborations, which I know we'll talk about today. But I am working on my next book, which is about my Confederate roots, because I just recently learned that my great-grandfather was a surgeon in the Confederate Army. Wow. And his father, so my great-great-grandfather, was like very close to Jefferson Davis and ran the basically the commissary. So this was recently discovered by me. I never knew that side of my family history. I lost my mother when I was very young. I was 16 when she died. My father died when I was 13. And that's the subject of my first book, which is called The Kids Are All Right. But I'm really interested in how my familial history was severed at that point, because we learn so much from the stories we're told. So that's my mother's side, sort of Falls Church, Virginia. There's this whole kind of Confederate history that I'm researching now that's deeply fascinating. And then that was on my maternal grandmother. My maternal grandfather was Welsh, and he was the horse expert.
Okay.
So there's a lot there to plumb. And then on my father's side, interestingly, he grew up in Quincy, Massachusetts, big Irish Catholic family, blue collar Irish Catholic family. He went to Johns Hopkins University. I think it was like a basketball or a football scholarship. But again, I know only so much because he died when I was 13. So I have a lot of those collected stories, many of which are in The Kids Are All Right. And sadly, many of his siblings sort of died early deaths as well. So I don't have there is work I want to do in really researching that side of the family. He was born in the United States, but his father came from Ireland, so my grandfather. So it's like a pretty interesting first question for this podcast, because it is something I've been thinking a lot about, which is, who are our people? Who do we come from? And what does that mean?
Yes.
So I've got Confederate on one side. I've got Irish Catholic on the other side. And I'm curious about, what does that become in me? Like, what do those histories and stories intertwine? And that's what I'm exploring right now.
No, it's very interesting. And I think people have been, maybe in the last decade, been looking more into their history and ancestry.
Yes.
Well, did you get to meet any of your grandparents?
My grandfather.
Oh, okay.
On my father's side, we called him Grampy. I have memories of him, and my maternal grandmother, who we call Grandma. I have very vivid memories of her. They both lived past their children. So my father and mother both died at the age of 50. And so my grandmother and my grandfather on, those different sides both outlived their children.
Yes. And you mentioned what your mom did for a living. And what did your dad do for work? So
my mom was a soap opera actress, and my father was, he worked in the kind of financial world. My first book, The Kids Are All Right, that was one of the mysteries we tried to really unravel, is like, what did he do? He wasn't an international man of mystery, but he definitely, worked as maybe an investment banker at some point, and then shifted and was investing money in Honduras in the late 70s. And it was all very kind of, frankly, suspicious. And when I was doing that work early on in researching The Kids Are All Right, I found lots of these old files, because when my father died, we grew up on a 13-acre estate in Bedford, New York, with horses. My mother was this, I wouldn't say glamorous, but it seemed like she was glamorous. She was a soap opera actress. She had been on Broadway. She, had this incredible career. And my father left her in terrible debt. And that was all related to these very bad business deals. One in particular in Honduras where he had invested in oil rigs. So the question of what he did, he didn't do it very well. And he left my mom in 1982 when he died in a car accident. My research, my sister and I, who wrote the book together, he left her in $1.1 million of debt in 1982. And she was a working actress. So she had co-signed many of the loans for these business deals that didn't work out. So she was then responsible. So there's, a lot of that's covered in my book. She then, within a month of his death, was diagnosed with terminal cancer. So that is really what The Kids Are All Right is about, this sort of double whammy of losing our father and then our mother getting sick. And she had to sell the house we grew up in. She subdivided the property, moved her 4 children into the caretaker's cottage, and continued to work in soap operas, around chemo and radiation, which is what the bulk of that book is about. I'm so proud of that book. It was my first book, and I wrote it with my younger sister, Diana, and we decided to interview my brother and my older sister, Amanda. And so the book tells the story of that loss from 4 different points of view. Since the range in age, Diana was 8 when my dad died, and I was 13. Dan was 11, and Amanda was 16. So then 4 years later, 3.5 years later, when my mother died, you just add 3 years to all of that. It was like very intense time, right? Yes. Wherever you were on that spectrum of growing up and identity forming. And then she died, which was like, we almost refused to believe it, because her death was slow, whereas my father's was sudden. So the book, when we first pitched the book, it was going to end when my mom died. And I remember the agent being like, "You can't do that to people. That's terrible. Like this is just like, go jump off a bridge. Like, this is awful." But we realized the book really was about our sibling love for one another, and how after my mother died, we all got split up to live with different families, local families primarily, and then a family friend in New York took my brother in. But we stayed connected through my older sister, and the book ends with all of us having our first Christmas together 5 years after our mother died. And like, I even well up thinking about that, because I remember the last line was, us telling all these stories about what Christmases were like when our family was intact. And Diana, who was the youngest, couldn't remember any of that because she was so young. But so the book ends with Diana saying, "Tell me another story." And we said, and we did. But I think that was what that book really was about, this unfathomable loss, and not realizing that the 4 of us getting separated as a result of that loss was kind of compounded the pain, because no one really understood the loss better than each other. And we were really kind of far flung to different places based on our age. I was in college, my brother was in boarding school, so that I haven't reread that book in a long time. And whenever I meet people who have read it or are even reading it now, maybe they just met me and they're interested, I'm always like kind of startled, like, oh yeah, that's my whole early life story.
Yes.
When you're writing memoir, you have to know that.
Yes. How old were you when you started writing that book?
Gosh, that's a great question. So I lost my mom when I was 16, my dad when I was 13. I wound up going to Georgetown University, and it's also in The Kids Are All Right. I moved in with my guardians, my legal guardians, in December of my senior year and in high school. And my college application was due the first week of January. And I hadn't done anything because I was dealing with my mother who died at home. And I was the only one who was with her, kind of acting like a nurse. We had nurses as well. But so the question on the college essay was, what has had the greatest impact on your life? Because I was already a writer and interested in, like, I loved English. I loved writing poetry. I loved writing. I didn't just write about losing both my parents. I wrote about my mother's final act because she was an actress. And that last Thanksgiving we had together, she came out, sat at the table. She was wearing her wig, full makeup. She was only like 85 pounds. She got dressed and sat at the table and ate an entire meal. And it was like her kind of last gift to us. So we were all like, she's gonna beat this thing. Oh my gosh, she's not gonna die. The four of us were all together. It was just this very magical moment. And then she went back to her room and just got violently ill. And then that was like the end, the beginning of the end. So my essay was like that Thanksgiving dinner was her greatest performance because she convinced her children that she actually wasn't going to die. I mean, who would not say, yes, let's give this girl a spot in college? So I literally got in everywhere I applied: Northwestern, Middlebury, Georgetown.
Wow.
Terrible SAT scores. I'm assuming it was my essay. And then we really laughed because my brother asked me to read my essay just to kind of inspire him, and he wound up just using it for all of his college applications. We laughed so hard because he wound up going to Rochester Institute of Technology. Was very kind of mechanically minded and did their photography program. But yeah, that was it's funny talking about it. It was such a long time ago, but writing that book was really what put me on my path of doing what I do now, which is helping people tell their stories.
Mm-hmm. No, that's interesting, even because you kind of wonder when that moment came about and when you knew you were going to be a writer as a career.
Yeah. And you had asked when did I decide to tell the story? So I went to Georgetown. I wound up doing a master's there I got a fellowship to stay at Georgetown and teach freshman writing. I went to Mississippi for a program called the Mississippi Teacher Corps, where I taught 10th grade English in the Mississippi Delta. Mm-hmm. I then went to Hong Kong. My boyfriend at the time was working for the Herald Tribune. Like I just was living this like kind of incredible life where I would go from one deeply interesting experience to another. But mind you, I didn't have anywhere else to go. I didn't have a home. I didn't have, a place. I didn't have a closet. So I would drop my stuff at my sister's house or sometimes stay with the woman who my brother was living with in New York. But it was a real kind of vagabond experience. And when I came back to New York, finally, probably I was 24, 23, I got a job working in publishing because I knew I wanted to be a writer. And that opened my eyes to like, maybe I could write for a living. Maybe this is my path. And I worked for Hyperion. Craig Nelson was the editor. He had just published Bob Evans' biography. It was called The Kid Stays in the Picture. So he was doing these big kind of Hollywood books. And I was like, gosh, that's going to take me a long time to be able to like make money writing books. So maybe I should do magazines. So I started applying for magazine jobs, and my first job was working for the managing editor at Vanity Fair magazine. So there I'm at Vanity Fair magazine, and I'm like a total imposter because I like look a certain way, and I grew up in Bedford and I went to Georgetown. So everyone just assumed I had very wealthy parents and like an apartment on Park Avenue. And no one knew my story. It's like doesn't come up unless, people ask you directly. Like, frankly, I was able to skirt it. So I was there for like 2.5 years. I was a year with the managing editor, and then the editor-in-chief, who's Graydon Carter, asked me to be his assistant. And I remember thinking like, I really wanted to be writing. I really wanted to start. And the managing editor was like, this is a great way to like, I was getting closer to like Graydon edited all these incredible writers. It was, Dominic Dunn and Marie Brenner, Gail Sheehy, like award-winning writers. So I did that job for a year and a half before going into writing for magazines. And I know this is very long-winded, but that's probably when I was like, should I write my own story? I wasn't quite ready. I started writing for magazines, and I did that for probably like 4 or 5 years when I was like, I'm going to try and get an agent. I'm going to try and do this. And so that's when I started working on The Kids Are All Right. At the time, I thought I was just going to write it. So I would do like week retreats on my own, just like making myself write. And it wasn't until another 5 years had passed, I was maybe even 10 years thinking about it, kicking it around, trying to do it, that I realized, well, a friend of mine said, well, what's the book about? And I was like, that's the hardest thing when you're writing a book. Like, what is it about? What are you trying to say? What do you want to say that only you can say? Like, why would anyone want to pick this book up? And he said, oh, is it another book about, a mom that dies from cancer? And it was so cruel in a way. The way he said, I was like, you're such a jerk. But at the same time, I was like, you're so right. Like, what am I trying to say about this book? What's special? And what's special about my story? And so I started all over again and just started with a scene from my father's funeral. And I sent it to my little sister who was living in Texas at the time, Austin, to read because she's a very beautiful writer and thoughtful reader. And she called me and she said, this is so moving. It was just remembering my father's funeral, just that scene. She said, but I remember it totally differently. So I wrote you back. And she sent this to me, and I was like, this is so interesting. Like, totally different memory. Same characters, same setting, totally different experience. And I was like, let's do that again. So we did another scene, totally different. It was like, this is so cool. And then I was like, let's ask Amanda and Dan. And then we did Dan's memory of the funeral, and his memory was he was 11 years old, and he worshiped our dad, and Dad wouldn't want him to cry. He was now the man of the family, so he really fought back crying. That was his memory. My memory was like 13-year-old girl. I didn't have the right thing to wear, and that really upset me. I didn't have a black dress. Like, that's what And Amanda, she remembered like eating an entire pineapple upside down cake that a neighbor dropped off. Like, it was all these like crazy age appropriate, personality like whatever memories. And that really gave me a way in to tell this story. And what I realized was it didn't just happen to me. It happened to all of us. And these sorts of tragedies happen all the time, and people metabolize them and experience them very differently. And when Diana and I were the main writers, and then we interviewed Dan and Amanda. But the really interesting thing about that experience is how much we didn't know about what the other person was experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really healing to share these stories, and it made you feel so much less alone in these losses.
Mm-hmm.
And it really forged our relationship. In fact, I'm going to Ireland next week for my sister's 60th birthday. And Dan and Diana are meeting us in Ireland. My father's family's from Sligo, so we'll go to Sligo, but we're really there to celebrate Amanda's 60th birthday. My family's so close. After my mother died, my older sister Amanda went to the Connemara coast to ride horses. Like, horses are her deep connection to my mother. We had horses growing up. So there's something very beautiful about us going back to this place that my sister really, really equates with the loss, and that we all can be there together. Another interesting thing about my family is my sister, my older sister. So when Diana turned 13, she was living with a family in Bedford, New York, where we grew up, and it just wasn't going well. So my older sister Amanda took her in as her legal guardian. And that's a part of the book that is just, it's laugh out loud funny. As sad as our story is, we all have this sort of dark Irish sense of humor. And so there are moments that are laugh out loud funny. And Amanda, being the sudden parent to Diana, offers a lot of them. But we have stayed incredibly close, probably not only as a result of the loss, but as a result of writing this book together.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, and like you said early on, that had to have been really tough at that point after your mom passed to be split up like that, but then able to reunite again, and even looking at it from today, what you're all doing today and seeing each other today.
Yeah. There's a cool Long Island North Fork story connection in that when Diana and I started working on the book together, the first stint we did was here in Orient. She came and we spent a month writing this back and forth, kind of experimenting with it. And then we found this wonderful agent, and she sold the book. Then Diana and I did these different writing kind of retreats where we would get together and we would workshop the book. But I also workshopped the book in Karen Braziller's workshop in Orient. So I live in Orient. I bought my house there in 2002, and my whole family came up to help me move in. And my sister Amanda, who was the keeper of all the family heirlooms, not that there were many, brought up a family tree that my mother made for my father on his 50th birthday, which was the year he died. And it's what is inspiring my next book, interestingly enough, because that's the Confederate and the Irish, looking into that background. But Karen Braziller was running this workshop on Village Lane, and that's where I started workshopping the pages. We'd sold the book, and we just needed to get it ready for publication. I'm sure Diana came to a few of those workshops as well. But I had such deep, meaningful relationship with fellow writers. L.B. Thompson, who's a poet. She lives here in Greenport. Skip Waxberger, who was a dear friend, who we sadly lost to cancer in 2011. He was in that workshop. And then there were other writers who kind of popped in and out. Charles Dean, a big kind of Long Island connection. So when the book did publish, we did a reading of it in Aldo's, where I was Liz, Skip was Dan, LB was Amanda, and we can't remember who Diana was. I think it was Karen Braziller who ran the workshop. But that's, when I think about my whole arc of beginning to write books, the Kids Are All Right definitely started, I started working on it in my mid-20s. It published in 2009, so I was 38. Right? I mean, it took me a long time to kind of figure out how I wanted to tell that story. And doing it with my siblings was just, I think, a really smart choice and something I'm still like really proud of.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely. And then also, I was curious even about from there, how you got into working with other people and helping other people write their books, their stories.
So for years before The Kids Are All Right came out, I was a magazine writer. And there was one point in my career, 2006, where I was writing for 3 different magazines on contract. So that was Glamour, Real Simple, and Ink magazine. But I had written for everyone, like Vogue, Cosmo, New York Times, New York Magazine. Like, I look back at my archives, and there was one year that I wrote 54 stories. So I was doing one a week, but some of them were like abortion, like big investigative stories. I did a ton of work in the space of reproductive rights, violence against women, sexual violence against women, domestic violence, because the women's magazines, they were like celebrity, fashion, and then what they called news features, which is like health and issues that women would want to know about. I wrote about autism. I wrote about autoimmune diseases. Like, it's kind of astonishing. That was the heyday of magazines. And I made a living as a freelance writer, which was astonishing. I became really kind of known in that world for a form called the As Told To, which is when you interview someone, you take that transcript and then you edit it in their voice into a story. It's as if they were telling you the story themselves. I did a whole series for the New York Times. The amount of As Told To storytelling, it's that Malcolm Gladwell says, if you've done it so many hours, it's like that tipping point thing. So that's why The Kids Are All Right kind of worked so well. I was really trained in how to do what you're doing right now. Ask questions, pick up on, fill in the blank. It's like, how do you get people to tell these kind of whole stories? And that is what led to me writing, in this Collaborator. They don't say ghostwriter anymore because you get recognized, but it's basically helping people tell their story. And another Orient connection, Sarah Burns, who is a literary agent and has become a dear friend. She had read The Kids Are All Right. And because it was at the time that kind of nonfiction narrative, there's like a term for, it was a little more experimental. Not a lot of people were playing with form in that way. And now it's you see it all the time. I used William Faulkner as my inspiration as I lay dying, where he told the same story of this Addie Bundren's death and taking her coffin to her funeral to be buried from all these different perspectives was like kept resonating with me as my siblings and I were just telling that kind of Rashomon,
Yes.
Right. So Sarah Burns, who is really like, I think this is what agents do so well, is she was like, I have these clients who have an incredible story and they need someone to help them tell it. And her clients were Martin Gonda and Caitlin Alafaranca, who became best friends through writing letters to one another. Martin was from Zimbabwe, grew up pretty impoverished. But of course, that's based on a Western lens. This is his community. He lived in a one-room hut with his siblings and his family and couldn't afford his school fees, so had to go and work at a bus station pouring tea. It's like you read it from Caitlin's point of view, who is this middle-class kid in Hatfield, Pennsylvania, who had like a Lazy Susan for all the different salad dressings they had. You know, like they were matched as pen pals. And for whatever reason, the two kept it up. And so this story was called, in the end, we called it I Will Always Write Back. It's the story of how these two became best friends through pen pal letters. And when Martin basically stopped writing, and Caitlin, through her complete and utter like persistence and love for this friend who she, again, they became friends through letters. It's so kind of old-fashioned and beautiful. Just became her mission to find out what happened to him. And when he finally got this one letter where she says, as a 13-year-old, did I do something to upset you? Why aren't you writing me back? He was working in the bus station trying to earn money to go back to school where he was like a straight A student. And he used all that money to buy stamps to send her a letter, which he wrote on the back of an ice cream wrapper because the economic situation in Zimbabwe was so dire. So she gets this letter on an ice cream wrapper and he shares his story. And she's just like, can't really wrap her head around this. So she takes $20 of her babysitting money and she sends it to him. Miraculously, he receives it. It wasn't intercepted or, you know, whatever. And he writes her back. He's like, thank you so much. This got me back into school. We bought chicken to celebrate. We only get chicken on Christmas. She was like, you only get chicken on Christmas? That's like a Tuesday and a Thursday for us. So they start like exchanging information where Caitlin's becoming more of a global citizen and understanding her privilege. And Martin is really just sharing with her, frankly, his brilliance in, you know, he takes the money, he goes back to school, he manages to get into this boarding school in Zimbabwe. And then Caitlin decides, there's this one great scene where she asks her parents how much money they've saved for her for college. And they say, enough for you to not have to worry about. And she said, because I want to send it to my friend Martin in Zimbabwe. They'd heard about Martin, but suddenly they're like, wait, who is this Martin? They thought it was like a Nigerian phishing scam, like what's going on? So the mother gets involved and she starts making phone calls, trying to figure out who he is, how he's doing, and finally gets through to one of his teachers who says, this is the most brilliant student we've seen in a long time. Takes it upon herself to not pay for him to come to school in the United States because they are a middle-class family. That was beyond their means, but she was like, I'm going to help him get a scholarship. Okay. So the book is told in letters and well, not all letters. It's this back and forth. It's Caitlin, Martin. So you're getting these two different worldviews, letters shared. They had saved all the letters. So I had all this incredible primary material. But that book, I was just talking about it earlier today. It was such a huge hit. It really resonated. Caitlin, who was an ER nurse, went to part-time nursing so she could tour and go to different middle schools and high schools. It just is a book that sort of touched people, and that, I think, is what really launched my career as a collaborator. And that led to, so that Sarah Burns was the agent, and we wound up selling the book to Little Brown. And my editor there was Farron Jacobs, who I love. And she called me and said, you know, I've got this other book I think you'd be really great on. It's with Malala. It was Malala's second book. And I was like, absolutely. And that book was about her experience as a displaced person. It was called We Are Displaced. She was like, no more I am Malala, we are displaced. So the idea really of that book was she wanted to use her platform to uplift all the stories of the incredible refugee girls and young women she'd met through her foundation. And that book made so much sense for someone like me because Malala's story was the introduction, right? That it was like she wasn't technically a refugee, but she's sort of the most famous displaced person. You know, the Taliban is the reason she was evacuated and left Pakistan. The randomness of landing in Birmingham in the UK was just because of a whole constellation of things that happened at that moment where there just happened to be someone visiting the army who had a relationship with this hospital. So she suddenly wakes up and she's in the UK and doesn't really understand anything that's going on around her. Her family's not there. And that first opening scene is just she's so wonderful. Like, you know, you think you meet your heroes. When I met her to do all of these interviews, I was so worried. Like, what if she's not, you know? And she was even more poised and funny and brilliant. So we spent 4 days together in Birmingham working on her story. And then we brainstormed all of the people she wanted to include. That was me, Farron, her editor, and Malala. And so I also worked closely with her foundation, coming up with the different women. And then I did all of the as told tos of these different women who were just sharing their stories. Like, you know, how like one day you're having dinner with your family and the next day you are being, you know, bombed out of your hometown, whatever the story was. Interestingly, they really wanted a story from Central America because she doesn't do her foundation hadn't done a ton of work there, but it was such an issue here in the United States. So I wound up interviewing a young woman from Guatemala, and I read from that chapter here at the library when the book came out because the story so deeply resonated with so many of our community members. You know, this was a 16-year-old girl who came on her own. And she wound up settling in Boston. I met her through a organization that provided legal representation for underage minors who showed up at the border. So that was my second book with Farron. And then that kind of led to others. But then alongside, I did a book with a woman named Joanna Coles, who was the editorial director of Hearst. That was a really wonderful experience because she was an editor at Cosmopolitan, where I worked and did a lot of like health journalism, reporting on domestic violence specifically. Her book was called Love Rules, where she took this sort of Michael Pollan approach to finding love in this digital age. So it was like deep research, lots of interviews, and then interviewing her. She's a journalist. She's a brilliant writer herself, but she was the editorial director at Hearst, so she didn't have the time to actually piece everything together. That led to this other offshoot of my career, which was helping more kind of formidable people like that who had stories to tell, but had these huge jobs and didn't have the time bandwidth to sit down and do them. So, I mean, I won't list every book I've written, but I'm up to 13 at this point. And I only started, my book was 2009. So I'm
That's quite a list.
I mean, I Will Always Write Back came out in 2015. And since that was my second book, and I think Prabal Gurung is my last book that came out in May. And I think that was up to number 12. So I was doing one book a year. That's a lot.
That's a lot.
I'm tired just saying it.
But just looking at all the work you've done, how do you navigate balancing between honoring someone's voice and then shaping a compelling story for
That's a
readers?
great question. I'm like such a loyalist. I do not tamper with language. If you said it, it will go on the page and I can help you say it a little bit better, but I'm not going to put words in mouths of the people I work with. And, and I think that is how I decide what project I'm going to do. I'm only going to work with people who I really think have a deeply compelling story to tell and have a very poetic or fascinating reason for wanting to tell it, and are also articulate, right? Who can actually, because they might say it was terrifying, and I can ask, okay, let's set me in the scene. Like, where were you? What was it like outside? I can ask them lots of questions to sort of set the scene to make it terrifying. That I'm very good at. But if you just can tell me it's terrifying and you can't elaborate on all the reasons why or how, I think partly why I'm so good at what I do is I am also a deeply psychological person. So I want to connect the dots always. Like, why is that relevant? Like, why are you telling me this? How does that fit into this psychological puzzle of what is propelling the narrator forward? I mean, the really wonderful thing about having written so many books is I really understand stories from the reader's point of view now. Like, you can't just say something and leave a reader asking multiple questions, right?
Yes.
I'm working on a project now that I can't talk about, but I will talk about in the spring, and I'm excited about it. And that's my job, is how do you satisfy the reader and keep the reader moving forward constantly, wanting to know more? And I always go back to whoever I'm working with and to get that information. I would never fill it in. Sometimes I might do brackets where I'll say something along the lines of, I was feeling really nervous because whatever. And sometimes if it resonates with who I'm working with, they'll finish that sentence and use that train of thought. But my favorite is when I'm early on working with people and I'll share with them an edited version of their transcript, and they'll be like, that's not me. I'm like, it's verbatim. Like, this is exactly what you said. Those for me are always the red flags. I don't want to work with those people because they want you to be a magician, and I'm not a magician. I am someone who loves a good, compelling story, and it also has to be deeply value aligned. I have to really care about what the story they're telling.
Definitely. But I wanted to we're going to switch topics a bit. But you mentioned the connection even with your first book in Orient and you're having the house set here in 2002. But what did you think of the North Fork when you initially came out, and what attracted you to the area?
I was writing for New York Magazine at the time, and I was assigned a story. It was 1999, and I was assigned a story on these two guys in Southampton who had this champagne outfit, and it was all like a Y2K, and they were these really kind of funny guys. So I drove out. I remember I used to drive a Volkswagen Vanagon. I drove out to meet these two kind of posh guys, and they kept talking about the North Fork. They're like, the North Fork, it's so cool. You should check it out. And I was like, I'm just here doing a story. But my next story was on the vineyards because I was curious, and I was like, oh, actually, they gave me the idea. They're like, go check out the vineyards. That's a cool story. So I pitched it to my editor. She's like, yeah, New York's Napa. That was the headline. And it cracks me up because that story's been written how many times now? But I wrote that piece in 2000, and I was just driving around, and I was like, what is this place? It's so beautiful. I'd been to the Hamptons growing up, just visiting friends. I had a friend whose uncle lived there, so I'd go in the summers. I had no connection to the North Fork. So I'm driving around. I'm like, this is beautiful. And then a dear friend of mine, Tina Fallon, who lives here in Greenport, and her husband, Sam Sifton. I have a much longer Tina Fallon story because her aunt was my mother's best friend, and her aunt, Karen, took in my brother. So it was at Tina Fallon's aunt's house that I would go crash, you know how these stories get so small and this. So I called Tina and I was like, didn't you just buy a place in Greenport? And she was like, oh my gosh, I love it. You have to come out here. And at the time I was really thinking about trying to buy a place in New York City and couldn't. It was so expensive. You could get the house that we bought, or I could get a tiny studio apartment. And I was really starting to think about writing my book. I was a full-time writer. And so I found this house in Orient. I looked at a bunch of other places, and then one day came out, saw this house, and I was like, this is it. I didn't know anyone in Orient, had no connection to anyone out here other than Tina Fallon. And when I called her and asked her, she knew the house. She's like, you have to buy that house. And I owe Tina Fallon a big thanks. And she's like family. So I knew it had been vetted, but I didn't know anything else really. And then I was here about 4 years when I started working on my memoir in earnest.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then even over that time, obviously the North Fork has changed, but you also have gotten involved in the community and helped start a local chapter of Coming to the Table. Can you talk about what inspired that opportunity?
Sure. So when I first moved out here, my community in Orient was interestingly very based in, I met some artists who were living in Orient, and Elizabeth Payton, who's a painter, she and I became very close friends. TJ Wilcox, Rob Pruitt, Jonathan Horowitz. There was this kind of cluster of artists, and I was the sole writer. Meanwhile, there's this whole publishing thing happening also. And when I met Sarah Burns years later, I was pulled into that world and have so many friends in Orient now who are in the publishing world. Coming to the Table is it's kind of feels like work that I so deeply cherish, and it was a long and winding road to get there. So I'm a mother through adoption, and my daughter's Black, and she was born in 2011, and Orient is not diverse at all. And bringing her home to Orient, we also live in Brooklyn, but I started to see how really bad white people are about admitting their own racism. And talking about it made people just so uncomfortable. But I also saw how omnipresent it was. And in a place like Orient and on the North Fork, it's more distilled. It exists everywhere. We were raising our daughter in Park Slope. It's it's just a bigger pond, but the racism was the same there. It was just more distilled out here, where Bella was 5 months old when Trayvon Martin was murdered. And I just saw how my white friends, it didn't register in the same way. And now I'm tracking Black Lives Matter was the result of Trayvon Martin's murderer's acquittal, right? And so I'm raising a Black daughter in a world where Black Lives Matter is becoming this very powerful movement, and none of my white friends cared. They just didn't care and when I say none, some started to, some kind of registered, but for the most part, people would say, it doesn't matter. What are you talking about? She's going to be fine. This kind of, so this was 2011, and I really panicked, to be honest. And I also started to question, like, what was I thinking? I didn't realize the violence, which I think is a cop-out. I know that now. But I really kind of dove in and started doing a lot of workshops. There was a workshop called Border Crossers. There was a workshop called, organizations like Raising Race-Conscious Children, Showing Up for Racial Justice. And it was the Showing Up for Racial Justice. So I was going from one learning experience to another, just trying to like wrap my head around the violent history in this country that I had been, I could say protected from, but now I would say that I chose to ignore. I chose to ignore it. And I think that's the thing that too many white people do. They just say that was a long time ago. This isn't about me. You're going to make my white kid feel bad. It's like you are just choosing to ignore this very painful reality. That's what I was doing. So as I'm leaning into this sort of reckoning and awakening, and I'm also writing, working with Elaine Welteroth on her book, More Than Enough. She's a Black woman who was the first Black editor of Teen Vogue. And, when I walked in for that interview, she was like, this blonde with a side part is not writing my book. But then 2 hours later, she's like, when can you start? Because I was so hungry for I wanted to know what her experience was like. She was in Condé Nast. I was at Condé Nast most of my life. Like the experiences she was sharing with me, I was like, oh, that absolutely happened. Of course that happened. And it's just like hearing and understanding and sort of seeing these experiences from another perspective or point of view. That was how I learned so much about what needs such attention in these relationships and the way we talk about race. So I was at a Showing Up for Racial Justice workshop. It was called Calling In. Anyway, it's an organization that is really about working with white people on dismantling and grappling with race and racism, because it's really our problem. It's so at that circle, you had to go around and say the icebreaker was my people are. So my people are Bohemian, my people are Jewish, my people are intellectuals. And as they were going around the circle, I was like, my people, I didn't know they were Confederates yet because I hadn't done that part of the history, but I knew because my mother had mentioned when I was very young that her ancestors owned slaves. And I use that language because that's what I said in the circle. Now I know you say enslaved people because owned slaves makes the person an object. So you don't say that. You say they enslaved people. You make it an action, a verb. And I said that, I shared that. And it was just so interesting because everyone gasped, and I was like, then I went home and I said to Gideon, I shared with him, this is my husband. And I said, Gideon, I just had this like crazy like realization that I shared with people I don't know. And he put his hands up in the air and he goes, not my people. And I was like, okay, white cisgender dude. I was like, you have some way benefited from this. Like we're all in this together in a way. Like this idea of, he wasn't shaming me. It was just, actually loving and jokey. But at the same time, I was like, this is part of the problem. Like we don't talk about our history in ways that can really grapple with the fact that most of my white friends were like, not Trayvon who, they'd say Trevor who, like or one woman said to me, a woman in Orient, I was very upset. I can't remember which of the string of, Black Lives Matter, moments where maybe it was, oh my gosh, there were so many, Tamir Rice, like just feeling very upset one day. And I think I was like fighting back tears. It was bad. I'm like embarrassed about it now because again, I should have known. But I remember seeing a neighbor and she, kindest person in the world, and she just blinked at me and she said, "Which one is he again?" Like it was that same thing of like slave versus enslaved, right? Like it's not about me, push it away. This isn't. So that same night I started Googling like white ancestors owned slaves, like, looking for organizations that could actually just delve into that conundrum, that like very complicated, painful. And I found Coming to the Table. And I had done so many workshops and retreats and whatever. I went to a Coming to the Table circle in New York. So Coming to the Table was born out of, there are many different stories, but one of my stories that I think helps listeners understand it was, there was one of the storylines was there was a Thomas Jefferson reunion, and one of the descendants of Martha and Thomas Jefferson said, "Why aren't we including the Sally Hemings descendants?" And it caused kind of an uproar. Like,
Yes.
so that, and then he started his own reunion inviting, the Hemings descendants as well as, and it really kind of makes you question, this is Thomas Jefferson who wrote the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, enslaved a woman who he had 6 children with. There's like a lot of questions about how many, etc. Anyway, it got to this point of like Martin Luther King coming to the table. It comes from that line from his "I Have a Dream" speech, where he dreamt of a time where the sons of enslavers could sit at the same table, the sons of slaves. And I went to the first circle in Manhattan, and it was just a diverse group, Black, white, and everything in between, frankly, like sitting in circle and doing something that they call racial healing, where you just sit and kind of talk about experiences with race and racism across racial lines, so you can really look it in the face and kind of understand all the ways in which we're all impacted by racism. So it moved me to the point that I reached out to the organization and I went to a 3-day gathering on my own, My sister was down in Virginia. It was near Virginia. And I had done so much work, and I was like, there's no way you're not solving racism in our lifetime. And all of the different approaches and ways of thinking about it, I wound up seeing Coming to the Table's approach being one relationship at a time. So I come back, this is 2018, and part of the way of doing these circles is you need Black and white facilitators. That's their sort of way that they design it. So you have a Black facilitator and a white facilitator. So I reached out to Pastor Natalie Wimberly, and we joke about this because she just did not answer my email. She's like, "I don't want this white woman from Orient talking about racial healing. What is going on? No, thank you." And so I still have those emails. She never responded. Then I went to the church with my daughter, Bella, and my husband, because we were invited by the choir, youth choir, Carrie Brown. She's so wonderful. And then Pastor Natalie's kind of looking at me, trying to figure me out. And then George Floyd was murdered. So I reached out to her again, and I said, "I don't know if you're planning on doing anything, but I'd love to support." And she's like, I don't need your help. Like, she was so like, "I'm not interested." And I was like, "That's cool. I get it." And then I can't remember how she and I finally did. We were sitting together. She was doing the vigil, and I kept saying, people are going to want to come and show up. They're going to want to support you. People need a place to grieve. This is on all of us. After that, I did a story on her for the North Forker, and I think she got to see like who I am. and how much I'd thought about this. And then she and I put together a group. This is how the chapter started. It was Carolyn Peabody, Margaret Cowden, Sylvia Daly, myself, and Reverend Donna Schapper, who used to be at the Orient Congregational Church. And we spent a year reading the Little Book of Racial Healing, which is coming to the table sort of like, that's like how to start your own chapter. You have to actually understand what it is that you're doing. Okay. And then we started, that's how that work started, slowly. And I'm just like, it is all, for me, it's like the only thing that makes sense. It's really forming deep, trusting relationship. It's been really powerful. And what I love about Greenport is Greenport really is such a perfect place to do this work, because people, the person who said to me, which one is that? I don't know. That person has since left, but people like that person come to these circles and they understand. You need to make mistakes. You need to say things that might be offensive. You need to actually learn how to talk about race in ways that you're not going to get cast aside.
Yes. No, definitely. And then just lastly, I was wondering what your hopes are for the future of the North Fork and its community down the line.
Well, I think the work I'm doing at Coming to the Table, and I want to emphasize the group has grown. So we've got Valerie Shelby, Nikki Gruelle, Sylvia Daly, and Pastor Natalie. Those are the 4 facilitators on our leadership committee. So there are 4 Black women and then 4 white women. It's Margaret Cowden, Carolyn Peabody, Megan Boyle, and myself. And Megan came up because she was just really interested and just so dedicated. She teaches a yoga practice. She's so wonderful. Nikki, I invited in because she was this Black woman who was raised in East Marion by a white grandmother. What I love about Coming to the Table is there's ways in for everybody. Val Shelby, long Greenport, she's been here, and she took her a while to feel like she could trust and be part of this. But what we've been doing together is widening our circle and our table. So now we have more than 100 people on our membership list. Wow. And we do, we support Juneteenth. We help organize Juneteenth and really believe that everyone should mark this historic day. I like thinking about that a lot, like I think about the Pride Parade. I think every time we do something that really underlines inclusivity, deep, loving inclusivity, we are branding Greenport and the North Fork as an inclusive place. And I think the North Fork needed that, because when I first came out here, it didn't feel that way. It felt pretty closed off. You saw Confederate flags flying. I'd love to talk to people who have Confederate flags up here about what does that mean to you? I have a Black Lives Matter sign in my yard, and I know it upsets a lot of people. And I really would love to talk with them about why, So my vision for the North Fork is more of these conversations. And what I love about Coming to the Table and Juneteenth, and shout out to the North Fork Art Center who partners with us and so supports that message of inclusivity. We do the Tamara Linear reading, which was one of my books I'm deeply proud of. There's so many ways to have these conversations where people can really grapple with and practice. And I feel like the North Fork is a prime place to do it, frankly.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, but I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today and share your story and your career in writing and really all the wonderful work you're doing with showcasing important stories.
Well, thank you for having me. I think it's such a wonderful podcast, and I'm really honored to be part of it.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 207 with Liz Welch. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.